Thank you, Sonny, and thank you for welcoming an Oxford man to Cambridge. Well, there should be a PowerPoint at some point coming on behind me, but if not, I'm just going to flag my points as we're going through. But the title is this: how do we even begin to trust again when we are disillusioned by today's society? Now, I'm coming at this speaking as a former banking regulation solicitor, and there's probably been nothing bigger, has there, in the past decade, which has so focused our disillusionment in the great institutions of society than the worldwide banking crisis. I was at Hogan Lovells. I was dealing with business and retail banking. And I remember being on secondment from there to Barclays Bank in Canary Wharf, part of their mortgages team, when the market was really drying up and everything was going crazy. Team meetings would be, what's the government doing now? What's this next set of regulations? What's going on? Now, last year, Barclays was fined $2.4 billion. $2.4 billion for its part in various fixing scandals. And the funny thing is, we're now starting to lose track of which scandal these fines are actually referring to, because 60 million of them, of that tranche, were placed on Barclays for actually violating an earlier settlement for conspiring to rig the interbank lending market. So we have fines in relation to other fines now, scandal in relation to other scandal. Barclays' chief executive said last year that he regretted some individuals within the bank have once more brought our company and industry into disrepute. What do you think? Is it individuals or is it the system? How disillusioned are we in Cambridge today? Because it's not just banking, is it? Think about politics. If you put into Google MPs' expenses scandal to try and find out exactly which year that whole thing broke, what you find is an article from just 8 hours ago saying a latest MP expenses scandal from the Telegraph. A few entries below that, the heading is this: MPs' expenses, a scandal that will not die. It's still going. 2009 was the answer, by the way. And yet, that wasn't the first thing to cause disillusionment either, was it? Just think about one of the highlights of my marriage recently has been introducing Catherine to the Bourne trilogy. And think about Bourne. Think about the relationship that the Bourne films have had on the James Bond films, for example. How would you compare the two? How has Bond changed after the influence of Bourne? I'm not thinking so much about realistic violence or about the levels of action. Think about plot architecture. So we should be on. No. Think about plot architecture. You've got James Bond developed in the Cold War when the Soviet nuclear threat was high, built on memories of good versus evil from World War II. And so Bond's enemies were generally evil foreign institutions, whether or not political. The big change with Bourne, of course, which has captured and tapped into the mood of the West today, is that Bourne is first of all an individual, and his enemies are the leadership of his own institution. Do you see the difference there? His story is about an individual's journey to separate himself from his institution, to reclaim his own independent identity. And we've got so many stories now, including the latest Bond film, of the enemy is the institution, global institutions in general. It's no wonder the West can't quite make up its mind what it thinks about Edward Snowden, for example. If you look at some of the Cambridge Union talks coming up and last term, a repeated theme is, what about these big institutions can we trust in the EU? What about the establishment of the Church of England? And so it goes on. How can we begin to trust when we're so disillusioned by today's society? And yet, what's actually new? Hasn't this trend been developing not since Bourne, but look at George Orwell, look at 1984, look at Animal Farm. And weren't they based on something earlier, the Russian Revolution in 1917, for example? And what's fascinating when you read these stories of revolutions is that not only was there a widespread opposition to a prevailing existing system or institution, in that case the Romanov Tsars, But also, at the same time, there is a growing enthusiasm to trust an alternative kind of group. So the early revolutionaries, which became the Bolsheviks, which ended up being led by Lenin. So now we're on the lots of trust, the next one. Because it seems as though it's actually human nature to be trusting. Even in the face of huge opposition and restrictions from one institution, we're looking to find something else to place our trust in. So last year, the Washington Post published a study to show that millennials are disengaged and disillusioned with the US party political system. Each generation it measured from the baby boomers to the Generation X to the millennials. And what it discovered is that each successive generation showed 10% decrease in participation in party politics. And yet, while that level of trust or participation was decreasing, something else was on the rise. When you look at social media and the increase of engagement with social media, roughly a quarter of millennial Facebook users said that at least 50% of their posts that they saw on Facebook related to government and politics. Now, only 18% of Generation X's was that true for, and 16% of baby boomers. So what that's saying, actually, is that it's not that we're becoming less interested in participating in society as a whole. We're finding different ways of doing it. And party politics has been replaced by a much greater participation on social media and networking in electronic ways. And then you start to think, actually, are we a trusting society now or not? And yes, we are, because if you look at what goes on social media, look at our Facebook accounts, look at what we are as a generation willing to make public about our own lives in a way that beggars belief in comparison to what previous generations would be willing to trust the world with knowing about themselves. So I'm not sure that it is a straightforward narrative about a decrease in trust in general. Because although we're less institutional and we trust the big institutions less, we are far more networked. We trust people through networks. And trust is ultimately about participation. It's about joining something, participating in it, because you're happy to play the rules and go where it takes you. Trust is the opposite of individualism taken to the extreme, which is narcissism. Trust is about participating in society. And then you think of it that way, and you realise that we're all maxed out in trust and participation with the busyness of our schedules, the number of cultural, sporting, other kinds of events that we're committed to. So, if it's not about trust per se, what is it that we're finding so disillusioning about big society today? What is it that's causing us to not trust in the big institutions, even though we are happy to trust so many other things? What, if you like, are the criteria of when we're happy to trust? Well, I thought of a few here. We like to trust something that's personal. I was working once temping in the civil service, and a letter was circulated addressed to someone saying, "We're no longer be making payments into your account because you are dead." And you think, guys, come on. That is the best example of an impersonal institution you can get, isn't it? And the banking system has become so impersonal. The bankers themselves don't understand what's going on. It's so complex. The political system so alienated. And yet, on my Facebook profile or in the squash club, I can be who I want to be. I can interact personally. And that allows me to trust and to participate. A second thing is that we like to trust something that really is addressing a clear threat. So how much you trust NATO is actually proportionate with how much you fear Russia, for example. How much you allow the government to track your data will depend on how imminent we feel the threat of terrorism is. And so often the threats which institutions were created to combat are maybe not the threats that we're feeling today, and that's why we're happy not to trust them so much. We also like to put our trust in something that joins forces for a good cause. So, for example, David Bowie's death, Alan Rickman's death from cancer. If we are going to tackle a big issue like cancer, then of course we need to join forces and not just be individuals. We have to participate in the fight for cancer, don't we? And so President Obama has just committed, or is talking about committing millions of dollars in that great fight, and think, yeah, I want to be part of that fight. I want to participate. I want to put my trust in that exercise. And so we have big organisations dedicated to fighting good things. Cancer Research UK, for example, and we don't mind participating in that. So fighting for a good cause. And then, of course, the reason why we've struggled so much with our big public institutions is because we feel that maybe they were originating for joining forces to fight something bigger than us that's for a good cause originally, but now they have taken all our tax money and the benefits of everyone joining forces, but they're using that force against us, or that's what many people fear, that they're in it for themselves, that the bankers are in it to gain for themselves, the politicians for their own expenses. And lastly, we like to trust something which hasn't yet let us down. Now, this is maybe seems banal, but I think this is perhaps the most important of all. There's a constant desire to be part of something. We've got to put our weight somewhere. We can't be not sitting on our chairs or not putting our weight somewhere on the floor. We exist in a complex reality. We've got to be somewhere. And yet, where we've been has let us down. So if you think of the Premiership, constant flow of managers, as if simply a change in personnel can fix something. Or more to the point, perhaps in politics, it's impossible for a party to stay in power more than X number of years, because eventually people's general dissatisfaction in life means that they want to change. And so the word change becomes a very, very powerful political tool. So we've got all of these reasons why we struggle to trust, or why we do trust, whether it's personal, whether we feel a threat, whether it's something that is fighting a good cause, whether it's let us down or not. And yet, what's the real problem? What's the real problem? It seems as though on the one hand, we've got these institutions which are far more likely to tick the boxes of being something you don't want to put your trust in. And we've got, on the other hand, social networks and other kinds of networks which tick the boxes of things that we do want to put our trust in. So surely it's simple, right? Can't we just abolish institutions on the one hand and spend the rest of our lives in other kinds of social networks? That's surely the problem solved. And of course, it's not that simple. And this, I think, is the real heart of the question. Because these good entities, these good networks, the revolutionaries, always seem to end up becoming institutions. Even looking at a pop concert, I was looking at something on YouTube a few days ago, where all of the most famous rockers who were anti-institution from the past were up on the stage next to Tony Blair and the Queen or something. In time, all of these trustworthy networks informally seem to end up generating a life of their own and becoming a threat to us. And it seems as though there are two ways in that can happen. Number one is just that, like the banking system, there is a cumulative effect of lots of flaws and faults that in the end, maybe it's like a Microsoft computer with lots and lots of bugs in it. In the end, an aggregation of all of those faults means that the system in some way has become complex, taken on a life of its own, and is working against us, it feels. So that's one reason. The other one is when a network, in order to really do good, concentrates authority, and then that authority is held in the hands of flawed individuals. People are always worried about concentrated authority. Now, either way, whether it's just an aggregation of individual faults or concentrated authority in the hands of flawed individuals, can you see that the institution or the network has taken on a life of its own? It's almost become unavoidably a threat to us. And both of those reasons actually come from the same source, which is that however much we want to talk about the threat from big institutions, actually the real issue is one of flawed individuals, either way. And you can't get around that. If you look at financial regulation, for example, initially it was self-regulation of the banks. That didn't work, so we had the Financial Services Authority. And then after the banking crisis, the government said, well, scrap that, let's give it to the Bank of England and also create two new regulatory bodies, the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority. And you're starting to think it's probably the same personnel sitting at the same desk under different brands, And really, what's changed the heart of the problem, which is that whether it's politics or expenses or banking, all of these institutional flaws in the banking system was really just a culmination of individual flaws. People who either bend the rules, break the rules, or write the rules to suit them, and then say, I was following the rules. And everybody knows that what they were doing is unconscionable. And I think what this gets us to is the slightly sobering realization that really at the heart of all of this discussion of networks and institutions, we can't get away from the flawed individual problem. And that there's none of us in the room who thinks that we ourselves don't count within that. And yet the question today was, what about today's society? Why are we disillusioned in today's society? And you might say to me, well, surely individual flaws have been relevant throughout history. Why is it that this feels worse now? Why is the modern era worse? And I think we can say three reasons for that, why we're feeling it in this room more than perhaps would have been the case 50 years ago. First of all, modernism gave us a very unrealistically positive view of human nature. Yes, we're good, we've got good bits and we've got bad bits. But after the Enlightenment, we were basically told that we can be educated and fixed to the point of being perfect. That was what modernism was really telling us about ourselves. It sounds great. And then if you have a state system or institutional system which starts to be built on that philosophy of what a human person is like, very, very optimistic, you can create great utopian claims for what we can do, how the state and other systems can provide us with peace, health, education and justice, and we'll have a perfect world. No other generation in history had been given those claims, because never had we had such, thirdly, technology and the ability to project these visions to make those claims plausible. So we've never felt quite so let down. The problem's been the same, which is the flaw of the individual, but modernism has actually made us feel it far more. Now, this is all sounding fairly discouraging. Why is this a Christian event, and what have I got to say about how the Christian worldview or the Christian narrative of space-time reality, how does that relate to this? How can we learn to trust again? And the Bible's analysis of humanity is consonant with what we've seen. It talks about humanity at a corporate level. We're one human race, and at an individual level, that we've all got personal responsibility. There's good in us, made in the image of God, but flaws in all of us, because we're all part of a flawed race. And it says that that's not a problem that we can fix for ourselves. And it says that we're right to be disillusioned with these big institutions, but also the Bible, in a sense, is more cynical than perhaps you guys, because it's saying you can't find another place to go, a new network or a new revolution to be part of, which won't actually fully end up creating more problems. It's the human race in totality which is infected, the Bible would say. And yet the good news, this is where the analysis ends on a positive note coming from the Christian worldview, is that there was a single individual who interrupted the downward spirals we've been talking about, and who turned it all around so that we can talk about upward spirals. So the Old Testament, for example, gives a wonderful example of a failed institution. Think about this theocratic nation given God-given laws, perfect institution. The New Testament's analysis of why it failed in the Old Testament was its limitation of individuals, that no single person within the system was escaping from the human condition. Even when they concentrated authority and got themselves kings, the kings were flawed too. But, and this is the hinge of history, what happens when a king figure is God incarnate? Because you've got a concentrated role, a very strategic role there for rescuing the whole system. And actually you've got someone who's not flawed. And that, of course, is Jesus Christ, who, being king, had the legal capacity to die representatively for the system. And because he was innocent and was raised to life 3 days later, that central claim of Orthodox Christianity, something massively significant happened for this whole trust discussion. Because death was reversed, degeneration was reversed, decline was reversed, and instead the Bible describes the resurrection body, the physical human body of Jesus that came out of the grave, as an upgraded human body, an upgraded humanity, a prototype, the first of a new upgraded race, which means that every one of us in the room can actually switch, if you like, switch network or switch institution to connect personally to the resurrected Jesus Christ, who is king and head of an upgraded humanity. Now, this is crazy, but it's true. And the wonderful thing is that we can connect to him, not by logging on or something, or not by filling in some forms, but do you remember all those features of what makes trust attractive to us? Personal. He is an individual, and his resurrected body, the Bible describes, has the capacity for individual connection with us as individuals spiritually, invisibly. Star Wars would love this, wouldn't it? Invisible spiritual connection with a resurrected king. And that's wonderful. You can be who you are, and you can be spiritually connected to this king for good. And it joins forces for good against a threat. It overcomes the problem of death and degeneration, because even though we make such little progress on earth, it is still progress that those who are connected personally to this Jesus, who is now in heaven but a human, connected by the powerful transforming force of the Holy Spirit, gets incrementally slightly less degenerate during our lives. That's the promise of the gospel, of the good news, which means that a friend of mine, when I was living on a South London council estate, who got stabbed and who wouldn't get out of his bedroom for months, discovered how to trust and how to participate in society again when he thumbed through to Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." And he wasn't joining an institution. He was recognizing the reality of a person of Jesus Christ who would shepherd him. And on that confidence, he walked out and later on got married and is doing incredibly well. And how do you actually join Jesus Christ? Trust. Trust is about participation and joining. And it's when we say, well, actually, I'm part of the problem. I'm flawed myself. But there is one man who isn't. And I can actually join into him by admitting that I'm at fault, that he is perfect, that he offers me the benefits of that representative death and that resurrection, and I can be part of his family. And that means that you have the best of every world, because you don't have to try and find a new planet to escape all these institutions on earth, which is impossible anyway. We carry on being citizens of the UK or wherever we're from. But at the same time, we have this life-transforming personal connection with the resurrected Christ. That is the Christian hope. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of things to discuss there or to argue about, and you might be wanting to discuss around the table. And what I suggest is that we just take 5 minutes to chat around the table, think what was really being said there. And maybe if you just want one question to think about whether my suggestion that flawed individuals is ultimately the root of this whole conversation. Think about that, because unless we're clear about what the problem is, then we can't really talk about what solutions are. Over to you.
Crossroads and given the option to pass and look back at goals we've missed. Rainbows are burning bridges. If you squint a little more, it looks the same. But ooh, it's a little bit of me inside you, gathering what you've lost. Ooh, it's a little bit of you in everyone. Can never keep a secret. gathering which you've lost. Ooh, just a little bit of you in everyone. And I'm watching you now. I see you building a castle with one hand while tearing down another with the other. And I'm watching you now. I see you building a castle with one hand while tearing down another with the other. And I'm watching you now. I see you building a castle with one hand.
Interrupt those conversations. Sorry for the short amount of time we had for discussion, but we love to hear any questions. So I haven't got any texted in, so does anyone have any questions from the floor? And if you could wait for the roving mic to come round, that'd be great. No questions?
Everyone completely understood and completely agrees.
Yes, one in the front.
Hiya. So you were saying that it's difficult to trust big institutions because of individual flaws. But how do we know that the church isn't a big institution full of people with flaws, and how can we trust the church?
Thank you, that's a great question. Yeah, notice that in my talk I didn't talk about, first of all, joining the church. I was trying to make that point, and I could have said more about the problems shown in the Old Testament when we see religion primarily as an institution and thinking about joining some big church state or something like that, which is what the Old Testament showed us. That is a problem, and Jesus was full of criticism for religious institutional authorities who actually showed hypocrisy and all of the flaws that we know in ourselves. So I actually first of all said that we're joining Jesus as a person. That's the wonderful, wonderful thing about Christianity, an individual who is perfect, who used his authority to lay down his life. And so then the church gets defined as that network of people who are all trying to trust in Jesus and finding their lives incrementally improving, maybe only a little. And so I wouldn't want to say that when we're joining a church, we're joining an institution. I'd want to say that we're joining actually a global network of people who recognise their faults and who are gradually trying to improve by the power of Jesus transforming them on the inside. Now that means therefore that by definition every one of us in the church will be flawed, but the hope is that we recognise that and that we are receiving power from Jesus to actually show love to each other and to change. Does that help?
Great. Anyone else?